much for coming along once again. This evening we're going to continue our look at, in effect, the effort to subvert climate science and to counteract it altogether on several different fronts. In the past we've looked at the government effort to discredit climate science and the particular effort to undercut scientific discourse in general, not just climate science, but the whole effort to, in effect, denigrate the contribution of scientists as if they're some sort of special interest group, instead of the valiant researchers and witnesses to our current circumstance that they are. The government has been undercut, in effect, by a larger effort beyond particular political parties, but a individual political party seems to have been captured by this corporation group of corporations trying to, in effect, subvert the public understanding so as to forestall effective public policy. This is what we're going to look at directly now, because what the corporations undertook as a strategy, what might be called weapons of mass deception, WMD of their own kind, corporate WMD and the global climate crisis. Corporate WMD have been operating for quite a while. In fact, we only recently discovered how long they've been operating. Way back in the 1970s they started to organize themselves, and they took several different strategy tacts which are now becoming apparent. In the last 2 years, these have become apparent because of the investigative reporters that have undertaken the work to trace back what some of these companies have been doing over the years. You'll remember a few times back in our series we looked at the war on science, particularly the war against Joel Clement, and his resignation, very publicly in the Washington Post, a letter of resignation in which he basically said he's a whistleblower on the Trump administration. But it began to be apparent that the whole issue was bigger than that. There was a general government attack on climate science, led by people like Senator Inhofe and, of course, the current Secretary for the EPA, Scott Pruitt. Beyond that, we looked at the general assault on information about climate and other things that's been taking place now for quite a while as part of the Republican attack on the free press and on the information flow to citizens. The stupider the citizens are, the more easy it is to pass legislation that is against their interests, but they don't realize it, because they've been brainwashed by a media that has, in effect, presented only corporate solutions to things. Well, in addition to those 3 sessions, we then now want to look at the fact that within the petroleum industry there was a recognition and indeed a wide-scale acceptance of the climate science right through the 80s and into the 90s. Take a look at Shell.
Far out over the Atlantic, a flying observatory. On board, another day of familiar drills and routine procedures. Even at the frontiers of science, understanding comes rarely in a flash of intuition. More often it emerges gradually from a mass of patiently gathered data. Sampling, for instance, the mix of gases in the atmosphere at different times and seasons, different altitudes. Or monitoring the flux of life in the oceans, the movement of its hidden currents in relation to the changing temperature of its surface waters. research of this kind is being stepped up worldwide. The need to understand the interplay of atmosphere and oceans has been given a new sense of urgency by the realization that our energy-consuming way of life may be causing climatic changes with adverse consequences for us all.
Okay, well understood. Back in the 90s, in fact, made a bit of a publicity issue. Shell wanted to get out there indicating that its scientists were, in fact, in the front ranks of those looking at the whole climate of concern, the question of climate change and its public implications. And they did it with a series of indications on film unit productions indicating that they were, in fact, on board with the climate science. But by 2015, there's a real switch. In fact, the switch occurs in the late 80s, early 90s, and Shell was a little bit out of step with what Exxon had in mind. Turns out, and in 2015, there's a masterful expose of the kinds of weapons of mass deception that Exxon had launched and then orchestrated an agreement with other oil producers to forward in the public's mind. Take a look.
The year 2015 ended with the UN Climate Treaty in Paris. It'll also be remembered as the year ExxonMobil, one of the corporations with major responsibility for climate change, was caught in a more than 3-decade lie. Exposés by the Pulitzer Prize-winning Inside Climate News and the Los Angeles Times revealed how Exxon concealed its own conclusions that fossil fuels cause global warming, alters the climate, and melt the Arctic. Exxon knew about climate change as early as 1977, but instead of taking action, the oil giant lied to the public and funded bogus climate denial paid for by the billions it made from practices it knew were harming the planet. Now a new investigation reveals that in the oil industry, Exxon was not the only one with something to hide. Inside Climate News reports nearly every major U.S. and multinational oil and gas company was likely aware of the impact of fossil fuels on climate change as early as the late 70s.
Yes, Shell was among them. They were aware of it, and in fact they were conducting their own research, verifying that, and occasionally getting out films like the 1991 one that we just saw. But what happens in this conspiracy then between large oil companies to develop weapons of mass deception? Take a look.
From 79 to 83, the oil and gas industry trade group American Petroleum Institute ran a task force to monitor and share climate research. The group's members included senior scientists and engineers from not only Exxon, but also Amoco, Phillips, Mobil, Texaco, Shell, Sunoco, Sohayo, and Standard Oil of California, as well as Gulf Oil, the predecessor to Chevron. Internal documents show that as early as 1979, the task force knew carbon dioxide in the atmosphere was rising steadily. The task force even briefly considered researching how to introduce a new energy source into the global market, given the research about fossil fuels' impact on global warming. But in 1983, the task force was disbanded, and by the late 90s, the American Petroleum Institute had launched a campaign to oppose the Kyoto Protocol, which was adopted by many countries to cut fossil fuel emissions, but was never ratified by the United States. The Exxon revelations prompted the opening of a criminal probe in New York over whether the oil company lied to the public and its investors. Exxon's climate deception has also sparked calls for a federal probe similar to the one that led to a racketeering conviction of Big Tobacco for hiding the dangers of smoking. With these new revelations, Exxon's oil industry peers, could more companies be targeted for investigation? For more, we're joined by the reporter who broke the story. Neela Banerjee is a Washington-based reporter with Inside Climate News. Her latest expose, Exxon's oil industry peers knew about climate dangers in the 70s too. Neela, tell us just what you found.
We found that as early as 1979, the oil industry, oil companies through the American Petroleum Institute wanted to explore the emerging science around rising carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. And we saw this through documents that we found as part of our Exxon research. And through that, we also found the former API employee who was the director of the task force for those 4 years. The task force was part of a broader air quality effort at API, and he filled out the picture for us too. And that, they wanted to follow the science, but that some of them were probably were already doing their own modeling, though it was not as ambitious as what Exxon was doing at its site.
Neela, you spoke with James J. Nelson, the former director of the American Petroleum Institute's Task Force on Climate Change, who left API in '83. He described a shift that was taking place at the time. Quote, API took the environment unit and put it into the political department, which was primarily lobbyists. They weren't focused on doing research or on improving the oil industry's impact on pollution. They were less interested in pushing the envelope of science and more interested in how to make it more advantageous politically or economically for the oil industry, unquote. Expand on that.
Right, and what Mr. Nelson said was that he didn't have any issue with that. He thought that that was the right tack to take, because at that time, even though it was under the Reagan administration, the power of the EPA and regulators was growing, and so the industry felt that it was not being properly heard, and they were trying to introduce science, they were trying to get research done, they were trying to have their papers published in peer-reviewed journals, and his viewpoint and that of the industry was that that they couldn't get their voices heard, and they were worried about overregulation. So rather than having scientists work on a task force and engage with policymakers, the best way to do this was to have lawyers and lobbyists, and that's how Mr. Nelson helped fill out the picture from the documents we had.
Well, you can see the pattern here. Basically, they see it as a science issue to begin with, but then very shortly realize that it's a political issue, then it might lead to regulation, and they hand it over to a unit about, in effect, public posture. How do they make sure that they can circumvent any forthcoming measures to restrict carbon, or even any publicity about that? And it's really quite staggering when you look at the, in effect, the question of whether they're complicit in trying to keep information not only from the public, not only from regulators, but from their shareholders. Why? Well, because the stock wouldn't be worth much if they're seen to be, in effect, about to be regulated in a major way. This is really quite staggering. Take a look.
ExxonMobil has long been criticized for allegedly hiding what it knew about climate change. Just today, a pair of researchers say that Exxon's own documents prove that is true. William Brangham has more. It's in our weekly series on the leading edge of science.
Thanks, Judy. Those two researchers, who are from Harvard University, they published a study today alleging that ExxonMobil tried to systematically mislead the public about climate change for 40 years. The researchers began this study after the energy company challenged critics to compare Exxon's own peer-reviewed scientific research on climate change against what the company publicly said about that science. Our science correspondent, Miles O'Brien, joins us from Detroit with more on this. So, Miles, tell us, what was the scope of this particular study?
Well, William, we're talking about a systematic scientific content analysis. 187 internal and external corporate documents produced by ExxonMobil 1977 through 2014. Now, during that time, the oil giant was funding a lot of rigorous studies on climate change. They were published in scientific journals, not easily accessible or digestible to the public. 83% of these peer-reviewed studies match the scientific consensus that climate change is real, caused by humans largely, and is an existential concern. But the study concludes ExxonMobil offered the general public something else, a diametrically opposed stance on climate science. Now, to assess ExxonMobil's public statements, the researchers went through the so-called advertorials that the company purchased on the op-ed page of the New York Times every Thursday for 30 years.
Now that's the way it was done. advertorials, not editorials, right? Advertorials. You can probably remember them if you read the New York Times. They were right there every Thursday, a little box about a quarter page, bought by ExxonMobil and presenting the information that they quoted from their own scientists, but in fact were efforts to be advertorials. They were ads, not editorials. They were ads for a certain perspective. The Times was complicit in this. New York Times made money off it, selling that kind of lying to the public. It's really quite staggering. Take a look.
And it was almost the same proportion, 81% of those statements, but on the other side of the coin, a completely divergent view. It cast doubt on whether climate change was real, it discounted human impacts, and they suggested there was nothing practical to do about it anyway. The study co-author, Jeffrey Supran, is a postdoctoral researcher at Harvard.
What we found when we read these documents is a clear, unmistakable, systematic discrepancy between, on the one hand, what ExxonMobil said and discussed about climate change in private and in academic circles, and on the other hand, what it said about climate change to the general public, no less than in the New York Times.
So, Miles, this whole research effort basically came out of a dare that ExxonMobil made saying, take a look at our documents. Explain what happened there.
Yes, William, this was an attempt to call a bluff, I think. ExxonMobil authored a blog 2 years ago daring its critics to analyze its publicly available documents on climate science. They said, read all of these documents, make up your own mind. The challenge came in the wake of some great investigative reporting by Inside Climate News, and it found ExxonMobil years ago acknowledged climate change privately is caused by humans and is a serious problem, but it did not acknowledge it publicly. The study co-author, Naomi Oreskes, is a professor of history of science at Harvard.
We see a picture where the company is aware of the evolving science and saying things that pretty much any climate scientist who would have been working at the time would have basically agreed with, more or less. But in contrast, when ExxonMobil turned to the public and published advertorials, there we see a very different picture. There we see a very consistent picture of emphasizing doubt, implying that we don't really know, that the science is unsettled, and therefore it's either too soon to act, or it would be too expensive to act, or the problem is too difficult to solve.
Miles, does the paper point out any specific examples that the authors say prove their conclusion about Exxon?
Well, William, there's one that really stands out. In 1985, an Exxon scientist co-authored a study that was really prescient. He predicted that global climate at the surface would increase by 2 degrees above pre-industrial levels. And this was way before the United Nations scientist came to that conclusion. And yet, 15 years after that study was released, in the New York Times, Exxon released an advertorial saying unsettled science was the rule of the day.
Well, you can see they speaking out of both sides of the corporate mouth here. The effort is to confuse, not to convince, but to confuse. Now, fortunately, some scientists have gotten so irritated at this that they've started to write over the years things like Climate Crock of the Week from Peter Sinclair. And he's then joined up with the Yale Forum on Media and Climate Change to look at the series that he calls This Is Not Cool. It's really very interesting to trace his material, and you can find it on the Transition Studies website. These are the kinds of things he put out. Take a look.
Clearly there's going to be an impact. So I'm not disputing that increasing CO2 emissions in the atmosphere is going to have an impact. It'll have a warming impact. How large it is what is very hard for anyone to predict. And depending on how large it is, then projects how dire the consequences are.
In the fall of 2015, an investigation by the Pulitzer Prize-winning Inside Climate News, as well as the Los Angeles Times and the Columbia School of Journalism, revealed a trove of documents from scientists inside oil giant ExxonMobil, showing that Exxon scientists understood the mechanisms and consequences of human-caused climate change as early as the late 1970s and early 1980s.
New York State Attorney General Eric Schneiderman recently subpoenaed oil giant ExxonMobil, apparently seeking documents that might show the company had downplayed the risks to profits and therefore to investors of stronger regulations on burning fossil fuels.
Now that's the whole point. They actually lied to their own stockholders. I mean, this is staggering. And Peter Sinclair has been on the airwaves ever since pointing out these kinds of things, as has the Union of Concerned Scientists, which published a very revealing set of documents about how the industry then undertook a playbook to deny climate science. Take a look.
The tobacco industry really pioneered the techniques that are used in the disinformation playbook to deceive the public about the science that their products are causing harm. And so when it was becoming clear in the 1970s and 1980s in particular that fossil fuel combustion was leading to the greenhouse effect, which caused global warming, the fossil fuel industry organized itself. They understood that the science was settled about this phenomenon, but they also understood that it was complicated and that they could forestall action, primarily government regulation, and possibly, as with cigarettes, liability, if they confused the public and policymakers about the causes. And so they took a big leaf out of the tobacco playbook in that they used the very same techniques, which involve funding of false science, hiring scientists to produce information and research that and not disclose that it's being funded by the fossil fuel industry, contributing money to prestigious institutions and hiding behind the names of those institutions when actually the research that's being produced is diverting attention from what's causing harm.
Okay, and they had a whole series of techniques which they outline in the Disinformation Playbook. Union of Concerned Scientists has put together a series of 5 football plays: the fake, the blitz, the diversion, the screen, and the fix. Then they indicate how these things work. It's really quite clever.
We've got the fake, which is basically taking fake scientific research and trying to pass it off as the real thing. We have the blitz, which to me is the most personally distasteful. It's when corporations try to not only besmirch the science, but they take the scientists and run their names through the mud and try and attack their credibility and harass them in various ways, including suing them and other kinds of legal harassment, sending them nasty, crude emails, and basically not only making their lives miserable, but becoming an object lesson to other researchers who might want to follow the same path. Then there is the diversion, which is very widely followed. This is when corporations will take settled science and through a variety of communications tactics will sow doubt about what is really settled science and make people feel like, oh, the science maybe isn't certain.
Okay, well, you can see this and get the discussion of it from the website. Please do. Basically, corporate at WMD, weapons of mass deception, have been unleashed by Exxon and others in order to sow doubt and, in effect, create this disinformation. We can ask ourselves, what if Big Oil and their consultants, like Danny Yergin, hadn't deceived us for decades? Where could we be now in addressing the climate crisis? Well, fortunately, locally, at least in Cambridge, there has been an effort to ignore those kind of deceptions and create positive change by preparing Cambridge for climate change and developing resilience. Resilience plans like this one opened up last week are some things that you should all study as citizens of Cambridge. Take a look.